Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going way back, before history books, really.
That's right.
We're tackling a huge question. How did societies become unequal? How did some people end up with more stuff, more clout than others?
And we've got some incredible research to draw on here. A really massive study, actually.
Huge. It looks at ancient settlements, villages, towns, all across the globe.
Yeah, over 1,100 archaeological sites. And, get this, more than 47,000 individual houses, or what's left of them.
Wow.
And it's not just one period. We're talking over 10,000 years, right from when people really started settling down after the last ice age.
Okay, so how do you measure inequality way back then? It's not like they had tax returns.
Exactly. No, the researchers did something really clever. They used house sizes.
House sizes?
Yeah. The basic idea, and it makes sense intuitively, is that bigger houses probably meant access to more resources. Not just, physical stuff, but maybe more labor, more connections, that sort of thing. Wealth in a broad sense.
Okay, got it. Bigger house, more wealth. So how do you compare inequality between different villages or towns?
They used a standard measure called the Gini coefficient. You might have heard of it used for income inequality today.
Right. 0 is perfect equality. 1 is maximum inequality.
Precisely. So they calculated Gini coefficients based on the variation in house sizes within each settlement. A low Gini means houses were pretty similar in size. A high Gini means big differences, some mansions, some huts, basically.
Okay, so our mission today, for everyone listening, is to get a shortcut to understanding the patterns they found. What were the big drivers of wealth differences way back then?
And hopefully offer some food for thought about today, too, without drowning you in academic jargon.
Exactly. And the central question is, after humans started farming, what really caused wealth inequality to grow?
Yeah.
Because the answer is, well, it's not what you might think.
Not at all. This is probably the first big surprise. You'd assume farming starts, people get surplus food, some do better than others, boom, inequality.
Yeah, seems logical.
But the data shows that's not quite right. Marked increases in inequality, those higher Gini scores, they typically lagged behind the start of agriculture, sometimes by 1,000 years, or even more.
1,000 years, really?
Yeah. It really challenges that simple idea that farming itself automatically creates a class system overnight.
So for a long time after people started planting seeds, things often stayed relatively equal.
In many places, yes. Especially, it seems, in the smallest settlements. The study uses this measure, social advantage, or SA score, basically how big and central a place was. In the smallest sites, SA equals 2, the Gini coefficient stayed pretty low, below 0.25, even long after farming began.
Why would that be? Maybe social pressure in small groups.
That's very likely part of it. Strong sharing norms, face-to-face community, maybe rituals that leveled things out. Plus, perhaps early farming just didn't produce a huge surplus. There wasn't that much extra wealth to fight over or concentrate initially.
Okay, but that changed. You said inequality did increase eventually.
It did. And the significant increases really start showing up in settlements with a social advantage score greater than 2. So in larger, more complex settlement systems.
So the scale of society starts to matter. Tell us about that. Settlement hierarchies.
Exactly. That's a key concept here. As populations grew, you didn't just get bigger villages, you got whole systems of settlements. Think small hamlets, larger villages, maybe a main town or center, all interconnected in a region. A hierarchy.
And that hierarchy itself predicts inequality.
It seems to, yes. That social advantage index, the SA score, captures this. It combines how high up the ladder a settlement was and how many levels there were in that region's ladder.
So like the capital city in a complex kingdom would have a high SA.
Precisely. And the study found a clear correlation. Generally, higher SA scores meant higher Gini coefficients, more complex hierarchies, more inequality.
Interesting. And they also looked at the difference in inequality between the top and bottom, right? The PSE.
Right, the polity size effect, or PSE. That's the gap in Gini values between the top-tier settlements, the apex sites, and the lowest tier, the basal sites.
And what happened to that gap over time?
Generally, across the world sample, the PSE increased over time, which suggests that living in those bigger, more central hubs offered more opportunities for wealth differentiation. The rich got richer, maybe, especially in the centers of power.
Did that happen everywhere at the same pace?
No, and that's another fascinating layer. The timing varied. Asia saw the earliest increases in this PSE.
Which makes sense, maybe. Early agriculture, early complex societies.
Plausibly, yes. The Americas saw the increase happen later, and Europe was even later still.
Why later in Europe?
The researchers suggest it might relate to how agriculture spread there. often through the migration of farming groups rather than just adoption by locals. This might have led to a more dispersed pattern initially, without single centers dominating quite so early.
Okay, so settlement scale and hierarchy, that's a huge factor. What else did the study point to? You mentioned something about land.
Yes, absolutely critical. It's about how much food production was limited by land itself versus just being limited by how much labor you had. They created an index for this called forescale.
Forest scale. Okay, break that down.
So low forescale is where there's plenty of land. If you need more food, you basically just clear another field or put more people to work.
Right.
Labor is the main constraint.
Right.
High forescale is the opposite. Good land is scarce. People are investing heavily in things like building terraces on hillsides, digging irrigation canals, really modifying the landscape to squeeze every bit of production out of limited terrain. Land is the bottleneck.
Got it. So intensive agriculture on limited land, and how did that affect inequality?
Consistently across the world sample, high forescale values, meaning production was limited by land, correlated with increased housing inequality, higher Jishani scores.
So when good land gets scarce, the gloves come off, basically. Competition heats up.
That seems to be the inference, yeah. When land is the key limiting resource, those who control the best land or have the means to invest in improving it gain a big advantage. It creates more potential for some families to accumulate wealth, while others have fewer options.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, so settlement hierarchies and land pressure are major drivers. Did anything else pop up? Were there surprises in the smaller factors? Let's talk animals.
Animals, yes. Not as simple as you might think. It really depended on how the animals were used.
Okay.
Riding animals, horses, camels, etc., generally did seem to increase inequality.
Why would that be? Military advantage? Herding?
Possibly all of the above.
Mm-hmm.
Advantages in managing larger herds, maybe raiding or warfare, controlling trade routes, things that could give owners an economic or strategic edge.
Okay. What about animals for carrying stuff? Like pack animals?
That was more mixed. Globally and in the Americas, they seemed to increase Gini scores overall. But interestingly, in what they call Phase 2, the early agricultural period, they actually seemed to decrease inequality slightly.
Decrease? That's
Yeah.
odd.
It is a bit counterintuitive. Maybe early on, pack animals were more widely accessible and helped smaller households connect to resources or markets, having a slight leveling effect. But later, maybe ownership became more concentrated. It's complex.
And draft animals for plowing.
They seem to increase inequality in that early phase too, but the confidence in that finding as a consistent predictor across all times and places was lower. So, yeah, the animal story is nuanced.
Definitely not straightforward. Now here's something that really jumped out at me from the summary. Metallurgy. Metalworking. I'd have bet money that discovering bronze, then iron, would create new elites and boost inequality.
You and me both. That was my assumption too. But the findings, especially for iron, were, well, the opposite.
The opposite. Go on.
Iron smelting consistently showed a strong equalizing effect. It reduced measured wealth inequality.
Whoa. How? Why?
The thinking is that iron, compared to bronze before it, was potentially more abundant and maybe easier to produce eventually. This could have democratized access to better tools, stronger plows, axes, and crucially, more effective weapons.
So maybe empowering the lower classes or smaller farmers.
Exactly. The study even mentions potential links to the rise of larger infantry-based armies in the Iron Age. If more people have decent iron weapons, maybe they have more collective bargaining power against elites. It's a fascinating hypothesis.
That really turns things on its head. A technology actually reducing inequality.
Yeah.
What about bronze and copper?
They also showed a tendency to decrease inequality, but the statistical confidence was lower than for iron. So the strongest signal was definitely with iron.
Incredible. Okay, one more factor.
Yeah.
Governance. Did having chiefs or kings or more centralized control make a difference?
It did, but again, with regional twists. In Europe and in later time periods globally, more centralized governance did correlate with higher Gini values, so more inequality.
So power concentration leading to wealth concentration. Seems logical.
But in the Americas, the data suggested centralized governance might have decreased inequality, though the confidence there was low.
Huh. Another complexity.
It really highlights how the relationship between political structure and economic inequality isn't one size fits all. It depends heavily on the context.
And just to round that off, things like the specific types of crops grown or how animals were managed day to day seemed less consistent in predicting inequality across the board.
That's right. They had varying effects in different regions and time periods, but didn't emerge as those really strong, consistent global drivers like settlement hierarchy or land limitation did. It seems those bigger structural factors were more universally impactful.
Let's circle back to the regional pictures for a sec. You mentioned Europe's later start with inequality growth linked to migration.
Yeah, and the Americas tended to have flatter settlement hierarchies, maybe because they lacked, horses or oxen for large-scale transport until colonization.
But didn't you say some places like the Maya had high inequality anyway?
Exactly. Classic Maya sites show high Gini coefficients even without those super deep multi-level settlement systems seen elsewhere. It tells you other factors, maybe specific political or religious structures, were really powerful there.
Right. And we have to remember the American data gets cut off by colonization, too.
A very important point. We might be missing the later stages of indigenous developments there.
And Asia.
Oh.
You mentioned a wave pattern.
Yeah, a long-term pattern where both the average house size and inequality increase together over millennia. It echoes the Kuznets curve idea, which is usually applied to industrialization, but here we see it in deep history. Kind of mind-bending.
It really is. And what about those times after farming started, but inequality stayed low? Like that first 1,500 years or so, and you mentioned the Iroquois longhouses in North America.
Right, those periods are crucial. Two main ideas float around. One, maybe early agriculture was just not productive enough to generate large, stable surpluses. Not much extra wealth means less scope for huge inequality.
Okay, the small pie argument.
Sort of. The other is about social norms. Maybe early farming communities held on to egalitarian practices from their hunter-gatherer ancestors, strong sharing ethics, communal living, things that actively resisted wealth concentration. The Iroquois longhouses, housing multiple families in fairly similar large structures, might be an example of that kind of communal approach persisting.
So it's not just economics, it's culture and social rules actively shaping outcomes.
Absolutely. The researchers argue that as settlement hierarchies grew and land became scarcer, it probably reduced the outside options for poorer people harder to just move away and start fresh. At the same time, those traditional face-to-face leveling mechanisms might have weakened in larger, more anonymous societies.
Creating a space for inequality to grow.
Exactly. And they suggest that maybe around 1,500 to 3,000 years into this process, material wealth itself became more strongly linked to reproductive success passing on your genes. If having more stuff helps your kids survive and thrive, it creates a powerful incentive to accumulate.
A fundamental shift in what drives success.
Potentially, yes, leading to a greater tendency for wealth to concentrate over generations.
So let's try and bring this all together for everyone listening. The big takeaway seems to be that the rise of economic inequality wasn't just some automatic result of farming. It was much more complicated.
Particularly complex, yeah. It was tied up with population growth, how people organize themselves into larger and more hierarchical settlements, the increasing pressure on land.
And then influenced by surprising factors like technology iron actually reducing inequality and different forms of governance having varied effects.
Exactly. It really challenges simple narratives. This long-term perspective shows how these seemingly gradual shifts in society over thousands of years had profound consequences for wealth distribution.
It really makes you wonder, looking at our world today, all this talk about globalization, digital networks, is this another fundamental rewiring of human interaction networks, like those settlement hierarchies were back then?
That's a really provocative question, isn't it? Are we seeing echoes of those ancient dynamics playing out with new technologies and on a global scale, especially with ongoing resource constraints?
And we need to remember those regional variations and the unexpected twists, like iron. It's a good reminder that context matters, and the relationship between technology, society, and inequality isn't always what we expect.
Absolutely. It cautions against easy generalizations.
Well, this has been incredibly insightful. Taking this deep dive into the, deep past of inequality really gives you a different perspective. Thanks so much for unpacking all of this complex research.
It was my pleasure. It's a fascinating area, and it reminds us that understanding these long-term historical processes can hopefully shed some light on the challenges and patterns we see all around us today. And the research continues, of course. There's always more to learn.